With that, I'm going to invite Scott to return to the podium for Q&A. So please, Scott, if you'd like to come up, and ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question, please adopt the usual convention of raising your hand. Somewhat local, but there we are.
Thank you, Paul. And firstly, thank you, Scott, for probably one of the most inspiring presentations I've heard for some time. And my first question quickly is a flippant one to you, and then a more serious one to Paul. How quickly would you see lawyers being replaced so that we can see the end of robots, so that we can see the end of the lawyer joke? And Paul, how quickly can you get a copy of this presentation to your cabinet colleagues?
Unfortunately, it's weird. I think that doctors are going to be replaced before gardeners are, because there's so much money in, getting that particular thing right in a medical centre before it is worthwhile, fixing your lawn up. By that same value equation, maybe lawyers would be down the list of things that we would bother automating.
And I'll certainly be circulating this within government, don't worry.
One of an endangered species.
I think we're on camera, so if you can use the microphone.
One of an endangered species. Well, who does the government talk to, this national curriculum, about software and software development? Does it talk to you?
I haven't personally been involved in the curriculum development. I did see a report came out just recently, and on a personal note, it was somewhat disappointing. It did say that, from my quick skim of it over the last 24 hours, that they agree that computer science and technology is something that is very important and should be taught across all levels, but it shouldn't be mandatory. And they sort of said that it's difficult for teachers to teach it, so we shouldn't do it. It was a bit in the too hard basket. I think it also points to the sort of poor lobbying effort that we as an industry do with government. I did look at the quotes from the Australian Computer Society and others in the submission, and then I scrolled down to the next one after that was the arts. And the arts, society told the lobbyists there had a much more compelling argument why arts should be taught primary and high school level as a mandatory subject, and we did a very good job of articulating our case. So I think partly it's our problem for not articulating how important it is for us to develop technology, and I think part of it is we as an industry need to help them solve the too high basket, even though they want to do it.
So let's see, in a ATO wonderful type decision, I'm actually in front of the GAR panel because I don't run an enterprise, because I actually had the comment that I don't intend to make a profit till 2020. We spent $78 million last year, and my comment was we intend to invest every cent we make back into growing our company. According to the ATO, that means we're not actually an enterprise.
Can you give some context on the company and what you do, just so it makes it easier?
We have high-tech financial products.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment on the ATO's individual position on the objects at all. Maybe I don't know, Paul, any more qualified?
No, I'm going to resort to the Tony Jones formulation. We'll take that as a comment, but thank you. What I should ask, actually, and I neglected to ask this before, if you're asking a question, you might just start with name and affiliation if you've got it. That would be great. Who's got a question? Next.
Yeah, Nick Abraham, Director of a company called Integrated Research. And just on the question of creating a hub, a startup hub, I love the idea of Sydney or Melbourne as a startup hub. But so Chris Strode created Invoice to Go from the Central Coast, and created a $100 million company in a place where we wouldn't have ever thought it could be done. Just wondering if you've got any thoughts around the opportunities for software in regional Australia.
Yes, I think that it sort of goes to the point I made earlier that great companies can be built anywhere in the world. I'm an investor in a small company called Safety Culture, which is actually located out of Townsville. I'm also a Blackbird venture capital investment. And Safety Culture has a couple of dozen people, and they're doing extremely well. But the problem they're facing is that how do they then, as you get a certain size, they need to find a head of engineering. There's no one in Townsville that has that experience. At a certain size, they're going to need to have a head of product, a head of marketing. There's not going to be anyone in Townsville that has that experience. And so they will have to move somewhere, and the choices they have at the moment are they can move to Asia, where there's an availability of talent and a cheaper workforce in many cases in Australia, they can move to the US, where there's an abundance of people at a much higher cost. Or they could move to Sydney. In all honesty, at the moment, I'm not saying Sydney is anywhere near the top of the list that they should be considering, because there isn't yet that density. And so I think it's easy for a seed to germinate almost anywhere. There's plenty of conditions for that to happen. There's less conditions for that to turn into a huge oak tree. You need some pretty special conditions, and you do need that concentration of talent. And so I argue that whether Sydney or Melbourne or anywhere that the state, federal, and even local governments should align and say, okay, we are going to create a local economy around technology, and we're going to make sure that we put all the efforts into that area to create a critical mass. And once you get the critical mass, this is not, we should support the automotive industry with hundreds of millions of dollars every year to keep them afloat forever. This is more to create a flywheel effect, because once you have that tech hub, you do attract people from around the world. They do have high-paying jobs that pay large amounts of tax, and if we're successful, we pay a lot of that tax back to the government. In California, a lot of the government, a lot of the funding for the California government comes actually from tech startups and the tech industry. So I do believe once that we have a self-sustaining model, that will be positively sort of tax generating for everyone.
Teresa
Tanzariti, barrister. One of the issues that we've raised today is the success stories. But of course, for every success story, there's always going to be companies who fail. And one of the challenges I saw in a report in The Economist about the great value of California is their much more generous bankruptcy laws. Whereas in Australia, we have insolvent trading, we have, if a director's guarantee on their overdrafts or the business loans, you yourself probably were personally liable for your credit card debt. And we also then have the problems that when a company goes down, you have to pay employee leave entitlements, you have directors' penalty notices. So it's really a risk when you personally go for a company in Australia that you are personally liable for these debts, and once you become bankrupt, then you have all the penalties that go with bankruptcy of forfeiting your passport and never being able to be a director for 5 years. So to what extent, first of all, to you, did you feel that risk and feel that fear when you started? And also then to Paul, to what extent is the government looking at ways of making directors' personal liability less of a risk so that there is that entrepreneurship and you can go forward without that personal liability?
I think I was lucky when we started. We were 22 out of college. I think if we'd been bankrupt, they could have come for my Converse shoes, but there wouldn't be much beyond that they could have got from me. So I guess I was lucky to not be in that situation. There's always been an element of personal risk, I think, when you do a startup, and it's part of the course. You want the upside, there's got to be some downside. I don't know specific details, but I don't know of any software startup that I've been involved with that has gone under where any of that has been an issue, where the director fees and other things have been an issue. I'm sure if you get to a much larger stage, they are, but at a much larger stage, you should be more aware of your responsibilities in employee leave and entitlements and other things. If you have a sub 10-person startup, and I'll stand corrected if people can find examples, the ATO is really lenient as a general thing around startup companies in terms of tax and timing and other things. No one I know has ever been prosecuted on those things. People do use the amount they owe to the government as sort of a rolling loan in many cases to get their software company off the ground. I think that's actually a really good thing because the amount of money is inconsequential to the Australian economy, but hugely important to the chances of that software company succeeding. So I think generally we do a pretty good job. I haven't seen it affect the really small startups. And at a certain size and scale, I think you should be responsible for employee entitlements and other things, because I think that allows us to attract people and maintain our kind of quality and standard of living.
Just in terms of, is that something that's on the government's policy agenda? It's not been a point that has been raised very strongly in terms of startup policy, to be honest with you. So I've not seen any suggestion that that's an issue that is a major constraint in terms of startups. A lot of issues seem to be on the list ahead of that.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Let's go. One, two.
The US microphone makes the rules.
Okay, Peter Blackmore, AFDEC, we're audiovisual consultants, and incidentally, we most major projects we work on use Aconex, so great Australian product, and I'm proud to tell my colleagues overseas that it's an Aussie product. Loved your speech. I'm going to deflect the question via you, Scott, to Paul, and it's the thing about superannuation. We know that we have an innovative agricultural industry, and they cannot get finance in Australia. So, well, our agricultural industries get bought out overseas. Developing, taking a little bit out of the $2 trillion trough seems to be a good idea in terms of trying to develop the software industry. How do we do that? Paul?
Again, my first experience, I mean, solar, we did a great job at UNSW having a solar thing, and now it's largely developed out of China and other places. We developed Wi-Fi, and although it's a great Australian success story, but most of the benefits accrue overseas. So we do germinate a lot of these things as an agribusiness or software or other industries. And I do think it need to get to a stage where there is a local venture capital community that can fund these things through. And it also requires, as I said, a tech community and enough people to keep it in Australia. Because even if you have the funding, you need to make sure you have the critical mass. I don't think you need critical mass in every single industry. I'm arguing that software as an industry is so crucial, or at least as a discipline, is so crucial to every industry. So it's not just software startups. The software startups will breed an incredibly versed software and well-trained software industry, which will help Westpac and banks and everyone else to compete on the global stage as well. So I think software, in my mind, is a little bit different from specific verticals because it does enable so many other things. As a country, I fully argue that we should specialise in certain areas because we can't be good at everything. And if I look through the government announcements, the leak to the AFR this morning around some of the changes they want to make, agribusiness was one of the areas that was, I think, the top 5 where the government felt we had some existing kind of competitive advantage and was looked more favourably in terms of the things that they wanted to do. So I think for that specific industry and as a general thing, we should pick some winners.
And just on how you would make changes to superannuation, I'll be very clear on something that I think you shouldn't do and the government would not support, which is any change to the general principle that the first duty, the sole duty of the trustees of superannuation funds is to invest in the interests of members with a view to maximising their retirement. That is the policy purpose of superannuation. That being said, one argument that I've heard made by a visiting US venture capitalist is he was surprised that there was no sort of mid-market fund, there was no vehicle that super funds could invest in that gave a diversified exposure to startups. One of the points being that if you're a big super fund, you probably don't have the capacity to kick the tires on individual startups, and nor does it make sense as a percentage of your overall funds under management. So his observation was there seems to be a gap in the middle. Seemed to me to make some sense. It's not entirely clear though whether that's something government can do anything about or whether that's an opportunity that's waiting for the right entrepreneur to come along.
Good evening, Scott. Question and observation. First of all, I'm JJC from Senate SHJ. We're a public affairs and communications firm. But in terms of your observation about the lack of, I suppose, people going into studying IT, computer engineering and alike, given that you said the market has exploded in terms of the employment market, yet the enrolments are declining, why do you think that is the case when you think sort of basic supply and demand and kids looking at the end of year 12, what am I going to do? And they're very savvy, as you well know. And in point to that, I look at my own son, who's nearly 14, and it's that tech-savvy generation and the conversations we have, and your point, it amazes me, like, we grew up in an age watching free-to-air TV, his is YouTube. But in doing that, what he's also picked up, and he said to me, I talk to my friends, Dad, and we play like Minecraft and all those things, but we want to build our own because we don't like, the mod they're playing. And I just wonder whether that generation is like 4 or 5 years away because of where the environment they have been brought up with, where it's sort of just a natural progression for them to say, well, if I want to build a better game to play, well, I want to be a computer engineer or a software developer.
Yeah, so the lesson for everyone in the audience is let your kids play computer games. They'll grow up to be high-paid, well-versed software engineers. There's a couple of things there. It does go in ebbs and flows. So when we started Atlassian, when we first joined our university course, enrollments were at an all-time high because the original .com boom was on, and everyone saw this bill making quick riches in the US, and suddenly every parent wanted their kids to learn to do computing. And then the dot-com crash happened, and then those instantly halved over a 2-year period. Enrollments dropped down. So it's very cyclical in terms of fads that people go through. And it does, I think, it's the parents that have a huge influence and role models as well. I'd like to think in some way Atlassian's helped inspire some, school-age children to study ICT at a university level. The second thing is actually gender. If women were represented at the same ratio that men were, we would almost not have a problem. It is that significant. There's been a reduction over the last couple of years of women going into that. Now we have to work out why that is. I don't have the exact numbers at hand, but it is so stark that if we just got women in the same ratios, we would almost have doubling the number of people in ICT. And I don't know where that stems from. Is it from schools? Is it from role models? I don't know where, but that's one thing to look at.
Probably time for just one or two last questions. Wait, over here.
Hi, Kevin Cullen from UNSW. If you were running UNSW, what would you do? What would you change to increase the university's contribution to the startup community?
That is a very good question. Is that an invite? Look, I think the UNSW already does a pretty good job. There's a program there called, the scholarship program that I was a part of, the co-op scholarship program, that brings industry together with university and students, and that allows them to have work experience. So I think there's things like that do an incredibly good job of attracting students, and they've done a good job now of having more and more software scholarships. So that's one area where I think you guys excel at. If I could, one, I think it's really selling it to school children. School children look at a whole bunch of factors that they go into. Some of it's just pure TER or UAI or whatever it's called these days. Based. It's like, I got into 99.9, I'm going to go to medicine just because it's the highest amount, or I know doctors and other things. So I think role models and things we could do at a high school level around education would be the biggest thing that we could do. And then I think celebrating, alumni and other success stories through, to help inspire. But I'll give it some more thought on, I'll be there on Monday. Next question.
Thanks very much, Scott. Paul Greenberg of Nora.org.au, industry collective advocating for a technology-led retail. We spoke a bit about school and we spoke about university. Just a quick comment, I know we're short of time, on TAFE. So one of my disappointments, I think, in this role was how far certificate 3s and 4s in retail have fallen behind. A shout out to the new CEO of Service School Australia, Yasmin King, who's got it by the neck, and I think she's going to do stuff quickly. How do you see TAFE fitting in between school and university, and what part does it have to play in technology? And actually, my son also goes to the Bradfield TAFE and is doing software, and he's a year 10 student, so there's good work happening at Bradfield.
To be honest, I couldn't speak to TAFE at all. I don't think we've hired too many people from TAFE into software developers at the moment. I think with social universities, I haven't seen TAFE people come through, so I couldn't really speak with any authority on that.
Okay, well, I think we'll bring the Q&A to a close. I'm going to ask Ewan Crouch to move a vote of thanks. Ewan's a member of the JJC Bradfield Institute. He's a director of Westpac and an eminent business leader. And so I've asked Ewan to move a vote of thanks to our speaker this evening. Just before I ask him to do that, can I express my particular thanks to KPMG for their generous hospitality this evening. I'd like to express my own very warm thanks to Scott and to Mike for coming along, and to everybody who has come along for participating in this discussion about a topic that I think is of enormous importance. So with that, Ewan Crouch.
Well, I recognise as I stand between everybody and a drink, I need to be brief. So I've just got a few observations, because I found everything that Scott had to say to be incredibly stimulating, and the Q&A just amplified that. A fascinating conversation that we could all take and continue for some considerable time. Let me start by thanking Paul for putting together this lecture. I think it's a great idea. It's wonderful how the supporters out of Bradfield have come along tonight, and it's a marvellous thing, and I trust from the point of view of Paul and Bradfield Lecture, it continues for some time. I'd also like to thank Bruce Phillips as the client lead partner at KPMG for making available these wonderful facilities. And also the drinks which will follow afterwards, because that's particularly generous. I understand why Bruce did it, but it makes it even more generous when he has a number of colleagues that he has to explain all these things to. Let's come back to Scott Farquhar. In my own career, I'm now a director, as Paul mentioned, of Westpac. I'm a director of BlueScope Steel, chairman of Mission Australia, and on the Sydney Symphony Orchestra board. And I look at technology and I look at software development, and every board sits around with what they call their Kodak moment. And their Kodak moment is no longer the photo of the family album. It's in fact waking up in the morning to find that the business that you were directing has just shifted somewhere else because there's been this substantial change. I agree with all the things that Scott said in terms of policy suggestions. They're eminently sensible. ESOPs, 457 visas and education seem to me to be no-brainers. Superannuation is an interesting thing from a policy perspective, because whilst we should be able to use our superannuation funds and send them in the direction of software developers, we have to balance these competing interests, one of which Paul noted, the other is which if everybody wants to take their superannuation money out by way of a lump sum as soon as they can, then where does the cash come to do that? So there's going to have to be some trade-offs in a larger discussion in society. One of the things I remember from a lecture is that for 200 years, since Ned Ludd and his mates started to beat up the spinning looms in Manchester, technology has been replacing jobs. And for 200 years, economists have been saying to people, don't worry, new jobs will be created. And for 200 years, the economists have been right. But what it means is the new jobs aren't necessarily created where the old jobs were. And it's a wonderful conversation for society at large to say, as technology disrupts your business, and even disrupting is not quite the right word, as technology changes your business, what does it mean for those who work, and how do they then get equipped to work elsewhere? Because that's precisely what's going to happen. And we want them to work in Australia. I really do congratulate Scott and Mike for the business that they've created. It's hugely impressive. They did a deal earlier this year which values their business an enormous amount of money, and that just shows how much the world at large thinks of their business. I also thank them for keeping their headquarters in Sydney and for employing as many people as they do, and for persisting with some of the otherwise impediments or disincentives that might apply. Scott, you said the software is ammunition. I don't really know who uses Atlassian software. I'm sure it's used by many more organisations. As a director of BlueScope Steel, maybe one day it terrifies me to think that someone is actually going to use 3D printing to make my colour-bond roofing. But then I have to work out, well, how do I actually supply the steel so that it's their steel that makes the colour-bond roofing with the 3D printing. But all those sort of things are real challenges for business. You've stimulated us enormously this evening with everything that you've had to say. I thank you for the time that you've made available, and more importantly, I congratulate you on what you've achieved.